Happy Friday, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our Uncommon Conversations in Drug Development Trends. Today, we're going to be talking about the future of clinical research, pivoting from the old, embracing the new. We're certainly in some very interesting times that have some dramatic impact on clinical research. And today, we've got a great panel to discuss some of the implications. I'll introduce them in a second, but just a bit of housekeeping prior to that. I think we've got a number of questions when many of you registered to attend, and so we're going to be actually having our presentation, having our discussion revolving around many of those questions. But along the way, if you've got some other burning questions, please use the Q&A function. The panel will be able to see those questions, and primarily time permitting, we will answer as many of them or address as many of them as possible. I think that's the major housekeeping component. So our agenda is really threefold, looking at regulatory issues in terms of the changing regulatory landscape, looking at the overall development journey from early first in man, perhaps even prior to that, all the way to regulatory approval, perhaps even beyond approval into the post-approval landscape. We will talk about technology throughout. I think we're obviously all on Zoom right now, so we're already embracing technological advancements. I think one of our panelists, Patrick, noted today that this is his 100th Zoom call in the past, perhaps the past week. I think it's the past few months. So we're all Zoom experts. We're all embracing technology, whether we like it or not. So again, I think our discussion is going to be very fluid. We'll look forward to having an engaging discussion. And again, responding to any questions that we can, time permitting. Hopefully we will go certainly no more than an hour, perhaps even less than that. But again, we appreciate everybody joining us today. We'll end up with some final closing statements. And before we go further, though, I want to also, we'll have the opportunity to do a few polling questions along the way. And so just to make sure our technology is working today, let me put up a quick polling question and see if that's working. And hopefully that is. So our icebreaker, based on my screen background, and that's me here, in which city do you believe I'm speaking from? New York, Chicago, Tokyo, or Mars? Not a city, but a different location. So please vote now, and we'll just make sure that technology is working before we go further. We'll wait a sec for the results. And survey says, and I'm still waiting. Yeah, here we go. Wow. All right. Most of you recognize Chicago. I appreciate the few of you who put me on Mars. It's again a strange time, but no, indeed, I'm speaking to you from the Chicago area. So good. I'm glad our technology is working, and we can move ahead. I'll introduce myself. I'm Jeff Trotter. I'm a Senior Vice President at Worldwide Clinical Trials. I've been focusing for the last, seemingly 100 years or so on health economics, outcomes research, real-world evidence, observational studies. And we won't talk about that specifically, but again, I think it's part of the development journey that Patrick will address. So without further ado, Patrick, perhaps you could just briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Patrick. Good afternoon. I have worked in Europe and US and Japan and China with various companies, Lilly AZ, more recently with tech companies. I've been fortunate enough to actually take a couple of products which are now widely used to market and been through many of the normal challenges we all experience. I founded a company with a Danish professor of bioengineering and a Portuguese entrepreneur and antibody manufacturer recently, and that has been another whole new experience. But We're in a period of change and we have a lot of opportunity that we can take.
Thank you, Patrick. Your screen background is anonymous, but I believe you're somewhere in the UK.
Yes, this is a typical view of London.
Excellent. And my colleague Aman Kara, could you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff. So good afternoon, good morning to everybody that has kindly joined this webinar. I'm Aman Kara, a regulatory strategist with over 23 years of global regulatory experience, all within the CRO industry. And being a regulator is truly one of my passions as well. That's something I'm completely committed to. I love knowing what's going on, and I'm quite nosy actually. So what's been going on with the pandemic and how the changing landscape is really evolving day by day is something that I pay close attention to. In my role as global regulatory head of regulatory strategy here at Worldwide, I advise sponsor companies across the world how to bring their product to market in the most optimal way. So I'm bringing a regulatory lens to the development pathway. I'm actually based over in Vancouver in Canada. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, Aman. And you are technically awake, but it's quite early in the morning there. So thank you for joining us. So let's move on. And I think what I'd like to do is just have a very quick introduction. And this is a graphic that I found on the internet over the weekend. I think the Arlington Research Group is the citation. I've tweaked it a bit, added a few more circles here, but healthcare ecosystem is actually a terminology I've heard a lot in the last year or so, because we're all part of this ecosystem. I don't know that we've been completely inclusive of everybody, but clearly healthcare consumers and patients are appropriately in the middle of this ecosystem. We are CROs, we are product companies, we are insurers, regulators fill an important role, patient advocacy groups. The ecosystem is critical because anything we talk about today, we might focus on regulatory, we might focus on development, on a particular micro issue, but the implications are far and wide. Everything we do really touches everything else in this ecosystem. And I think the opportunity to really think about the win-win opportunities, the implications on other citizens of this ecosystem is something that we'll need to take into account, particularly when we think about how technology is increasingly bringing us all together. So that's kind of broad context I wanted to just start out our discussion with. And what we'll do right now is we'll go into the regulatory portion of our discussion, and I'd like Aman perhaps say a few words, and then we'll get into some of the questions that we've received already and start our conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff. So I'm even going to start before the regulatory landscape. So maybe it's because it's a Friday. Here we are. Not only do we have, of course, we've had to deal with the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on our personal lives, our loved ones near and far, how we work, caregiving. We're also at the time where I guess you could say a light is being shone on the clinical research industry in a way that in my 20 plus years has never been shone before. We've got more attention in the public eye more than ever, right? So I always like to say this pandemic, more than anything else, has been our industry's disruptor, right? So with that disruption, we have had unprecedented change in the regulatory landscape. So we all, I think we're all quite conversant with the classical drug development pathway, okay? And how that's been evolving slowly but surely. And there's been, you've seen regulatory agencies really trying to make that change with guidances and subtle regulations, I think. But more than anything, I think we have to note what the pandemic has really pivoted us to. And pandemic for me, if there's one word, it's how everyone has had to pivot quite readily as well. And we know, for example, for clinical research, that slowed down. Okay, before the pandemic, I think there were over 335,000 ongoing clinical trials worldwide. So that's just at those that have been recorded on clinicaltrials.gov. Now, with that, with this pandemic coming on, research has, slowed down. Okay, sites were shut down. Investigators that would be working on trials were, their research activity had been suspended so that they could focus on patients and treatment and what have you. So even, this has really thrown, I guess you could say in the UK terms, a spanner in the works. And regulatory agencies too have had to very quickly adapt and help the industry accordingly pivot. We've got the US, we've got the FDA, we've got the EMA, we've even got one of my favorite agencies, probably because I'm from there, the UK MHRA as well. And they've all given guidance on how to pivot accordingly for the pandemic. Now, interestingly, what I find is that, I've said this too when I've discussed this as well, that we've made this change, industry, regulatory have made this change and adapted, but are we going to really swing back to the way it was before? I don't think so. So, there's been a lot going on, and, being a regulator, this is where we have regulatory agencies, they've had a strong voice at this table, guiding the industry, like we've been in the news, and what have you, and what the best ways are to speed up the development of not only potential COVID-19 therapies, but looking at other therapies and other indications as well. That's really shone a light to this. So, what I can say, it really does say it's a changing landscape more than anything else. And, when I was monitoring what was going on with the pandemic, there were regulations and guidances globally that were coming out. I had to be looking, and any regulator would know, they were changing day by day. All we see that changing is now, week by week, month to month and things. But I think the take-home message is, what there was before is not necessarily how we're going to continue on in the future.
I think we've seen, thanks, Aman, I think we've seen, a number of our clients are reporting that the agencies are fairly responsive today. And you noted, if I'm not mistaken, that, you may not see that trend continue in the future. Anything we can do, here's actually one of our questions here, in terms of what we can do to encourage the agencies to maintain the perhaps blip of responsiveness that we've seen. I'll ask your comments, Aman, and then I'll see if Patrick has any thoughts.
So we've seen how regulatory agencies are willing to be flexible, right? And I think, honestly, industry, more than anything, let's put regulatory agencies aside, but industry is, I don't think that, we're likely to simply revert back to business as usual. I think now patients are going to speak up. I think companies are going to speak up, and here's now seeing, and I think regulatory agencies actually understand that this change is coming, right? If you can do this for a pandemic, you know what, you should be able to kind of do this for unmet medical needs as well. So I think people are going to slowly kind of have that snowball effect and thinking, you know what, we need to change things. We need to make that, to that slide earlier on, still withholding patient safety and making sure that a treatment is effective, patient safety, efficacy, and risk benefit, that's always going to be paramount. But are there places where we should be talking? And that's where regulatory agencies is one of those pieces in that puzzle to make sure that we're rapid.
Yeah, I guess I'll be the first one to utter the phrase new normal.
Yeah.
So Patrick, what are your views on the agency's responsiveness, and if indeed we can look forward to that level of responsiveness going forward.
Yes and no. I think the agencies respond quickly where they need to. You know, if you think back, 5 years ago, we never would have said that you could get approval for a major therapy on a phase 1 study.
Yeah.
But actually in 2017, the first CAR T was approved basically after a complex extended adaptive design phase 1 study. And last year, 44% of the approvals by the agency were for rare or orphan disease indications. So there are some substantial areas where change is ongoing, but it's in response to quite firm and directed reasons to change. I do think that we need to find allies as an industry to encourage change to continue, patient advocates, politicians even, people with an interest in better healthcare delivery earlier, payers. I think there will need to be some significant and sustained activity to maintain the willingness of regulators to change in a sustained way, in a broad way, because for regulators, everything that they change is potentially a risk. And that's a very real risk for regulators in terms of media exposure. So we need to give them reasons to believe that change is the right way forward.
Good point. And I perhaps I was remiss in not including politicians in that healthcare ecosystem, but let's leave it as it is for now. It's complicated enough. I think we're also hearing, and actually one of the questions that we got earlier on was about interagency collaboration, Aman. Are you seeing that as well, and is that a positive impact? I'll actually display that question.
Sure.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, interagency collaboration, something with my regulatory lens, I didn't actually see as much of. You know, we've had like Project Orbit, for example, where regulatory agencies are doing reviews together, I would say together, honestly. That was very recent, but what I see, and I know I keep on coming back to how the pandemic has forced the industry to pivot, but that is a very good example of how I don't think agencies have actually talked officially as such. The agencies have had kind of secondments, that people talking, you know, they've landed each other's staff in other agencies and what have you, but now we have the World Health Organization, you know, they publish direction. The agencies really got in there fast, and through the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, you know, they jointly talked about what information, what data you actually need before moving to first in human clinical trials, for example, for COVID-19 treatments and what have you. Now, if you look on their website, where they I think they were meeting bi-weekly at one point, but I don't know whether they're continuing, but they had virtual roundtables with like many authorities where they were taking turns, and they were discussing, and they were making that, you know, as transparent as they can in the public domain as well. I had not heard of that. It's always been kind of in the shadows as such, but now that obviously with the how this pandemic has become in the media and politicized and what have you, we see that transparency. Will that carry on? I think that it will to some degree, you know, absolutely, because, and I keep on falling back to that, if we can do it now, then, you know, should we be doing it for example, the rare disease treatments that are going on as well, because it's so hard to bring those up to market as well. Patrick, I don't know what you think as well.
Patrick, you're on mute.
I think there's a certain level of interagency collaboration ongoing, and that really is good. Whether it's going to change substantially broadly, I'm not sure. I think it will change in pockets,
Yeah.
Again, driven by need.
Yeah, need first, right? I think, and that does speak to that. We were thinking about who are the allies in industry, right? And And that's where I think patient advocacy groups are probably going to step up in a way that,
Yeah, you know, the patients kind of matter in this whole
yeah.
equation. So we're certainly seeing that, I think. Let's do another quick poll question. This one on how our attendees feel the regulatory agencies are adapting to changing times. So let's display that poll question if we could. There we go. So again, how do you feel regulatory agencies are adapting to the changing times, already embracing change and more collaborative than ever, at least talking about change, as challenging / confrontational as always, that's a bit judgmental, and flexible on COVID-19, but less in other areas. There's no right answer, but be interested in your feelings on that. 10 seconds, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Grace, can you display the results, please? There we go. So, yeah, it's I think somewhat consistent with what we're suggesting. Flexibility on COVID-19, but jury's still out, perhaps in other areas. I think it remains to be seen. I'd like to think that they're embracing change, and maybe maybe they're being forced to, but it is what it is. So, thank you for that. Any reaction, Aman or Patrick, to that result?
Not surprising, I think it is, the jury is still out about, pandemic when it's calmed down. What about the other therapies and treatments and the indications that are going on? When this has subsided or calmed down, what's going to happen? So, like I said, changing landscape more than anything.
Right. Well, I'll be the first to utter the phrase "shift happens," and
Yeah.
that's number 2 for today. So I'm going to display a couple other questions that we got earlier on. Whoops. All right. I think they're displayed, right?
Yeah,
Still?
they are.
Sorry. So again, the flexibility, does that extend to novel or virtual methods of data collection and monitoring? That gets into some of the technology issues. And similarly, are regulatory authorities more open to non-traditional sources of data? That's starting to get into the development journey. So Patrick, I'll give you the chance to perhaps lead our discussion on virtual methods, data collection, monitoring, non-traditional sources, those things. How are you seeing change happening?
Change is beginning to happen. It's driven by opportunity of new tech, ability to gather more data faster, gather real data from patients faster. But the speed of change in the next 5 years is probably less than some of the companies with the technology would expect. But perhaps the change in the following 5 years will be much faster than we actually think, because there is a threshold effect in this and also a regulatory acceptance effect. It's also partly driven by the increasing use of electronic records and electronic linkage within hospital and healthcare systems per se, particularly outside the US. And that ability to dip into existing data sets will allow the use of point-to-point transmission of data from patient to database, and the steady transfer of more data by that route without the use of intermediaries like sites will simply continue, driven by cost, speed, and actually quality. But it'll be certain studies in certain areas will be first, and there will be a lot of validation and proving to regulators required.
Yeah, Aman, actually a question popped up that somewhat relates to this. Do you see much difference in regulators around the globe in terms of their openness to embracing different data sources, EMR data, wherever? Are there certain country agencies more progressive than others?
My personal opinion, and I've been looking at this quite carefully, is that maybe in the US there is more acceptability or more openness right now, simply because there is there's more linkage, right, with data sources and what have you. And Patrick, you spoke about regulatory acceptability, and I think that is key. Now, going outside to other areas, and I am a bit of a data privacy kind of privacy kind of person as well, and I really do think about this as well. And regulatory agencies, I think, are going to look at this far more carefully in other regions as well as the FDA, about how we are making sure that patients' privacy is upheld when you're collecting or data, with these new methods and things like that. So there, for example, there's that question that you put up on the screen about, the flexibility would extend to novel or virtual methods of data collection. It is happening, right? It is happening, and I think with with COVID-19 and how trials have had to somewhat try to continue as best as possible, there have been novel approaches to data collection, of course, and it's a story you tell as long as you're able to tell the story to regulatory agencies. But I think on the other hand, and Patrick, to your point, in the next 5 years or so, it is going to be I think it's going to be more slow than what people think it's going to be like as well. There's too many pieces in the puzzle for me.
And from a technology point of view, this is a very fragmented and highly regulated environment in several levels. And tech companies don't really like being in highly regulated environments.
Right.
And it makes it much harder to scale the tech. The tech has massive advantages when it has massive volumes of data to manage. And then you can ask complex questions and get simple answers. But our fragmented healthcare systems and multiple ways of storing and transferring data make it really very difficult. So unfortunately, perhaps, it's unlikely that data collection from trials will be Uberized in the near future, good though that might be in some respects.
I'm going to move us along, but because the clock is ticking here, but we actually got an interesting question, and I'd like to perhaps start, Patrick, your section with this question. What are the agencies doing to encourage data generation in diverse populations? Most trials do not recruit patients that are representative of the disease population. Now, there may be good reasons for that, but how can we capture data in broader populations? This is, I guess, the intersection between, or perhaps the boundary between homogeneous clinical trials and more heterogeneous real-world data. So I'll let you ponder that as I move along the slides.
Shall I respond?
Please. Sorry.
Well, I think there's this scary thing out there that might catalyze change called the patient, or even the normal person who wants to maintain wellness. We assume that everything has to be in a structured RCT environment with frequentist or Bayesian statistics. But in reality today, a lot of medical or paramedical information is being shared freely on Instagram and Facebook and all kinds of other completely unregulated and not particularly structured or trustworthy sources. But I think we will start to see a lot more pressure from individuals to share and exchange data between groups with the same problem. And that won't happen tomorrow, but it's that kind of pressure that is going to be something that we will have to deal with in terms of relating trial data from very selected populations into the real world. And the agencies want to know what's going to happen in the real world when you go and put your new product into a population with loads of comorbidities, who don't take it properly, who don't take the other medicines properly either, and they don't want any surprises. So I do think that how individuals who are the recipients of healthcare think and behave will become increasingly important.
Yeah, I think the thing that I observed part of the 21st Century Cures Act in the US was an important component was the reality that medical decision making, there's a gap between the information we get from randomized clinical trials and the information docs use on a day-to-day basis for that patient that probably would have been excluded from the clinical trial because they're not adherent, they've got comorbid conditions, etc. So it's it's a fascinating world. And on that note, Patrick, I'm going to let you spend a few minutes sharing your views on the development journey. We'll use that as a backdrop and perhaps kick us off for this section.
Well, as we discussed when we were thinking about this session, the slides we've got up are very traditional. They're correct, but they're also incorrect in that already the typical development often doesn't exist. We've seen development take different routes. For example, orphan and rare drug development is usually a single pivotal study in a small and hard to access population with endpoints that may be derived from data or experience rather than endpoints that you can easily validate. That creates a lot of questions about how do you design, how do you validate your endpoints, how do you power your study? That's one whole area. The whole change in immunotherapy, whether it's oncology or other areas, has also moved us from a disease-led to a mechanism-led way of doing drug development. And there are a number of other threads, as we've seen in oncology, and now we're seeing the use in widespread situations of adaptive designs that we would never have contemplated a year ago, particularly for ARDS and other interventional studies in C19. There are multiple core studies of multiple revolving therapeutics being inserted into the same population and used alongside other interventions at different stages. That's actually, 5 years ago, that would have been quite revolutionary. Now we're doing it in Europe and the US on a daily basis. So the development journey has actually become a number of paths, and it's great because it means that sponsors with novel approaches to difficult to manage medical problems now have more opportunity to design tailor-made programs to get to market, but without going through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Some of them are fundamentally in the orphan area, phase 4 studies in a controlled environment. So I think the development journey has and will continue to change fundamentally, and it will also be aided and abetted by the increasing use of technology to capture data from some of these smaller, hard-to-access populations, and the ability to work hand in glove with patients' associations and other advocacy groups to actually bring the medicines to patients and involve them in the design of studies, involve them in how to get the better medicines to patients. And that brings the regulators along with doing things in an unconventional way. So although we've got a very simple description of the development journey, actually I think it's probably something that we wouldn't see very often today. Most development strategies would be quite different, much more tailored.
Right. So Aman, I'll let you start. Actually, a quick question. I think we've seen companies being more comfortable, and I think agencies, but I'll leave that to you, with the idea perhaps of diving into a data set as a simulated control arm for what would have been a traditional clinical trial, but a rare disease, patients don't want to be on the placebo arm. What's your take on how regulators are feeling about that?
I think they are becoming far more open than they've had to be, right? And that speaks to Patrick, your point as well. The slide that we put on about the development journey, similar to how we started off earlier on about how a drug is approved or something. It's constantly evolving now, because of that. And I'll speak to this. You spoke about the patients as well, coming along on the journey. We need to make sure when you're kind of developing a product, you need to make sure you're speaking to the regulatory agency, or probably even, you can pick one if you want of the main regions and what have you, but they have, for example, the MHRA and other agencies, they have like an innovation office or something. somewhere where you can go and get advice and early engagement with a regulatory agency to help you on that journey as well. So to be creative as much as you can be, because ultimately we do want to get these life-saving therapies out to the patients as soon as possible without, of course, without, lowering our standards of patient safety and efficacy, of course, as well. So it's something that's going to continually evolve. And I think that's going to be that's a reoccurring theme in what we're talking about. Like, it's not you can't think of this current snapshot, because it's going to be some pieces to the puzzle are going to be more quicker to uptake, others, and maybe patients actually are going to drive this more than we ever thought.
I was thinking about the innovation centers you mentioned, Aman. I hope they're not just working off of fax machines and.
Not from what I've heard, no.
Good. So Patrick, one of the questions that we've got in advance was about virtual clinical trials, and that's something that we're seeing more and more of these days. Pros and cons. Obviously, there's technology implications. There's data quality implications. Maybe some thoughts on your side on this new trend that may or may not have been accelerated by COVID-19?
Well, I think sightless trials are possible where the sight is not actually necessary part of the process. If you have inpatient studies, the sight is a mandatory part of the process. So for studies which are long-term or outside of sites, it's going to become more possible. It's going to be more acceptable to collect data where you inform the site rather than processing the data through the site. And we've already seen how data is being collected in type 2 diabetes studies directly. We've seen that patients respond more accurately to questionnaires if they're inputting it into their laptop rather than talking to a physician. We just need to use the opportunities where it makes sense. The big advantage of a site, well, two advantages of a sightless trial, if you want to put it that way. To do it, you have to be able to collect data direct from the individual. That then automatically gives you the opportunity to collect data at high frequency with validated quality and ask the right questions of the individual and potentially interrogate them. That's a much more dynamic way of gathering data around endpoints and potentially more meaningful for the individuals in the study and more translatable to the real world, because it allows you to be dynamic during the study and the data collection process. The other economic one is that, based on the various surveys, 30% of the cost of a study is on patient recruitment, 25% on site recruitment and management, 25% on the rest of the resources involved, and only 19% on gathering the data and processing it and turning it into a report. But obviously there are big areas there where you can both get cost savings and cut out intermediate steps, which potentially introduce errors. So each study is different and each population is different, and it will be very difficult in some populations like older individuals or children to completely change the paradigm. But it has already started in the way that telemedicine has taken off dramatically in the last 3 months, in the way that primary care physician interactions with their patients has become much more electronic in the last 2 or 3 years. It's only a matter of time before some of that technology translates into trials, probably around exploratory and secondary endpoints first, but it will eventually translate more broadly, and there will be a point where it does accelerate.
Aman, I'll give you a chance to respond. We're going to do a poll question right after you respond.
Sure.
And I'll remind our attendees that if they've got questions, please use the Q&A button and submit them. But Aman, what's your take on virtual trials?
It's been a long time coming to get to patient populations, and it's going to be interesting to see how this pans out. Like it's not so much about who got there first, I'll be honest, because there have been sponsor companies that have started virtual clinical trials and what have you, but I've read somewhere that it wasn't about so much the recruitment of patients, it was the retention of patients that was actually becoming more of a problematic feature as well. So I'm going to wait and see how quickly this is going to be a main, it's going to be a main adoption. But I welcome kind of, how we've been forced to think about something that has been on our agenda for quite a while, right? It's been there, virtual, how to make this more, how to make trials more available to the patient population. And there was that question earlier about diverse patient population, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But a long time coming. I'm still waiting and seeing, because I still see that disconnect between recruitment and retention, right? And what kind of data sources we're actually going to get and how much data we're going to get as well.
Yeah, no, I think the data sources are fascinating for recruitment. Retention, we really have to tap into the motivation of a patient to participate. I know that this is transformational from the CRO perspective in terms of how we interact with data and with sites and with patients. So we've got a poll question. The development journey, how quickly do you believe sponsors, drug and device companies, will embrace these changes, specifically virtual trials? Fully embraced today. Changes are starting to happen. Waiting to see if the trends are permanent or just a passing fad. Maybe within the next 5 to 10 years, or I don't see drug and device companies changing at all. A few seconds for your answers, and then we'll find out what the answer is. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Survey says, yeah. Interesting, kind of in the middle. Changes starting to happen is the leading answer. Waiting to see if trends are permanent or just passing fad. That seems to be, Aman, Patrick, any surprises on that one?
Not really. I mean, if you've got a study that your company depends on, you're a smaller company, or you're an AZ and it costs, the study budget is 78 million, you're going to be reluctant to take risks, right? So it's a question of risk, cost, time management. But the other barrier that is practical is patients often go to sites to have labs done. And today there's only a handful, less than 10 lab values that can be done remotely and sent in. But that's beginning to change as well.
Yeah.
And when that changes and the patients don't need to go to the clinic for labs, particularly if they're old, with Alzheimer's or whatever, that's going to be part of a process of several steps starting to make site involvement less critical throughout the study. So I totally get what the poll is saying, and I'm hoping that there will be the ability to change that. It's not there now, but there may be the ability, and the more sponsor companies ask for it, ask some of the big lab firms or the tech firms, do you have a tool that would solve my problem? The more likely we are to put 2 and 2 together and get 5.
One of the questions that popped up was, and this, Aman, you and I talk about this a lot, but do you think sponsors are going to be more embracing of these changes if they see their CROs take the lead?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because there have been times in, for example, my career where actually, Patrick, that speaks to you about, you were talking about risk and time, cost, and management. And I see time, cost, and management as the benefit, but then I see the risk as the risk, right? So in classical drug development, kind of, I guess you could say, speak, I think sponsors are really, truly looking at the risk benefit of actually undertaking this journey. like in a way that they probably haven't actually had to deal with before. That it's been forced upon them, and now they're like, okay, well, do we have to? Should we? But ultimately, I'm trying to speed up I want this product approved. I want this going through the development journey as quickly as possible. Now, it's our job, and I guess in the CRO industry, to guide sponsor companies and help them make those decisions about which aspects, which pieces of that puzzle they can adapt now, what they should be thinking about as well. I see a great responsibility on CROs actually.
Yes, particularly if CROs offer solutions for key areas, not for everything.
Yeah, exactly.
For critical areas that would help a sponsor, maybe one area, two areas, that's much more attractive and palatable from a risk perspective.
Definitely.
Thanks, Aman. Thanks, Patrick. So we'll move on to our third and final category here, embracing technological advances, and an interesting graphic here where we've got some new tech and some old tech. None of us are Trekkies, I don't believe, but it was always amazing that the folks at Star Trek had their tricorder or whatever it was to diagnose a disease, and now we've gone from that to actually the reality of handheld devices, of mobile EKG devices. So, I think my view is technology is being embraced, whether we like it or not, every day. And some of it's consumer-led, some of it's data that can be part of clinical research, but it's here and it's not going away, and it'll be fascinating to see what the next steps are. Maybe Aman and Patrick, can we talk to a couple of interesting issues that our attendees, when they registered, embraced and brought up, and the data integrity and quality issue. How do you monitor data captured directly from the patient on their wrist through a wearable, for example? What are your thoughts on that? Patrick?
Well, having done it, you have to accept that it's an imperfect solution, because whatever you're trying to measure probably doesn't happen 24/7 in an appropriate and reproducible way. And there is some value in baselining prior to the study what is actually going to happen with this particular wearable. To our surprise, with one study where we wanted to put wearables on an older population, we found out the validation of the wearable often consisted of less than 10 fit young Californians walking up and down the pavement outside the factory wearing the wearable. So there are some fit for purpose type questions to ask. But the wearables actually add useful data in a number of situations. A lot of the questions, I would say, are using common sense and a bit of discrimination to figure out the ones that simply will give you rubbish. But I think they will add a lot of value. And again, wearables will increasingly include non-invasive monitors, ketones, sugar, whatever, glasses, not just eye watches. The ability to measure retinal levels of different things on a continuous basis will start to change a couple of areas. And I think that data being real and in effect error-free is a different dynamic that the regulators will find it hard not to accept, because it'll be high volume and direct from patient. So today I think the wearables are not particularly effective, but worth trying in certain situations, accepting it's probably an exploratory endpoint.
Yeah, I think we've seen that as well, where a couple of our projects have involved actigraphy, where we're looking at sleeplessness, for example. And Aman, maybe you can speak to this issue from the regulatory standpoint, how comfortable or not.
Definitely, it's fast moving. Over the past few years, there is a movement within regulatory agencies, to think about how software is being used as a medical device. for example, as well. And that is still a new area, I feel, in the regulatory landscape. Although, Patrick, that speaks to your point about data acceptability as well, and the validation, that, and also how the data, what's happening with the data. We talk about this a lot, about how data is being collected, by whom, and what will it be used for. And I think about, if I was going to enter a clinical trial, for example, and there was some kind of portion that was going to be teched up as such, I always ask that question, well, is this going to be an app? Well, who's going to control the app? How will that data flow, of course? So it really speaks to data integrity. And like I said, fast flowing, ever changing. But I think regulatory agencies are being careful. They're being a bit wary, and they're being careful as well.
I think that regulatory agents being careful with what the pharma industry is doing.
Yeah.
I don't think they actually grasp what Apple, Amazon, and Facebook are doing now.
I agree. I completely agree with
those
that.
companies are never going to make it, I don't think, Patrick. Just flash in the pan. I'm obviously being facetious.
Yes,
but,
there'll be a flash in the pan till they acquire Pfizer. Sorry, I said that. No, I have no insider knowledge.
Indeed. So let's talk for a second. We've got about 5 or 7 minutes left.
Okay.
Machine learning, artificial intelligence. I mean, again, the folks at Star Trek could have probably never imagined that. But what's your take on the implication of AI, machine learning, natural language processing in the clinical research journey, Patrick, in particular? I mean, are there opportunities to accelerate development by virtue of tapping into data sources with AI?
Yes, where the data sources are massive, by which I mean if you can tap into 5 million lives data, or you can tap into a nation's pixels on all the radiography and the lab results, that's where our AI needs large volumes of data to work well. So if you give it large volumes to crunch, it will work well. AI will always struggle to identify particular subsets of a small population because you're not giving it the volume to work with. So it's already having substantial impact in the design, in the healthcare systems, in the management planning, but it's just not going to have the data to work easily in a small study in a novel medicine where there isn't much data to work with.
Aman?
That's interesting you say that, because I am a bit of a futurist, right? And I like to see how how the industry is future-proofing as such as well. And there is lots of talk about how AI might revamp clinical research. Patrick, to your point, and even yours, Jeff, talking about natural language processing. Can AI solve the issues of, the many bottlenecks in conducting clinical research, such as recruitment? Will you have access to these patients and what have you? Can you design studies? Will it be optimized? I've read a few articles and, looked at this a bit, where thinking about, how AI might be applied in the design of clinical trials, because Patrick, to your point, you're talking about, the data, you need large amounts of data. So, with that, could it become like that? Could it become faster, cheaper, quicker? I'm going to kind of like stop and pause there and think, we're not at that point where, at the agency level, you're talking a computer server at the FDA or the MHRA is talking to a sponsor company's computer server and pulling out that data. Ultimately, we're still people, right? So that humanistic effort is still always going to be there. Because aren't we trying to solve the problems for humans as well, not machines? So I'm kind of throwing that out there a little bit. But of course, there are going to be parts, but it really speaks to AI will work for the data, how the data, it's only going to be as good as what data you're capturing, right?
That's true.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, bringing it back to the patients is kind of important. Otherwise, we're going to be developing, medicines to improve robotics and
Exactly.
droids. So, well, let's do a quick survey. I know that a lot of the technology we've been talking about is some of it's been accelerated by the pandemic. Others were happening anyway. So, Grace, if you can pull up our last poll question. Is the technological shift seen recently, before and as a result of the pandemic, here to stay? Definitely and comprehensively, no turning back. Yes, but other processes, study design, staff competency, that's important. Regulatory acceptance will need to catch up. Some tech will be adopted, others will prove to be a flash in the pan, and we'll be returning to stone tablets soon. So please give us your answers on that, and we'll talk about that a bit. 3, 2, 1. Survey says. I love saying survey says. This is great. So yes, but other processes will need to catch up. Design, staff competency is something that I'm really concerned about, particularly from a CRO standpoint. We've got a lot of study monitors, but are they data scientists? And we may need a new generation of CRAs. Fortunately, nobody said we'll be returning to stone tablets soon. Patrick, Aman, thoughts on this?
Not surprising. Like, I just see overarching, you can see that really it's going to change. There is no turning back. How we move forward, that's a different thing. And we spoke about earlier about there will be certain areas which processes, pieces in that puzzle, which will be faster to adapt accordingly. But you bring a big point about staff competency as well, and regulatory acceptance. I'm a regulator, and I feel that there has to be more conversations with regulatory agencies as well about this, so that we're kind of, I guess, prompting the agencies to think a little bit more about this technological shift and data sources and what have you. And I think this is going to be a moving target for sure.
We'll go to closing comments. Patrick, good chance for you to perhaps comment on the poll question, and then I'll turn it over to Aman, and then we'll close almost on time.
I think the poll response is very fair. There are a number of urgent issues now that will stimulate change, and some of that change will stick, some of it may not. But we're going through a period of accelerated change. The science is changing fast. It has done in the last 5 to 10 years. The costs of healthcare are not sustainable. Costs of clinical trials have always been complex. Things will give.
Aman, final thoughts.
We have, for many years, we've been thinking about how we don't, it takes too long to bring a product to market. We don't have enough of a patient population. We're always struggling. Patient recruitment is a big area. Patient retention, I feel that, that can't really be put in patient recruitment puzzle. That's a piece of its own, to think about more than anything else. And I think this is where I think this has been a call out to healthcare these past few months about how change, how we've had to reflect in our industry actually quite a bit about what are we doing, how can we do it better. It's forced us, rather than running around and trying to get a particular trial up the ground, we're having to think a bit more strategically and thinking, okay, well, we need to think a bit further on down the line as well. We've been kicking the can down the road for quite a while, right? So what happens next? I think I'm just going to have to take up my regulatory crystal ball.
Well, thank you. I think, my last comment is I look at the cup half full. I think there's great opportunities to improve the process. I think, even this pandemic has cast a positive spotlight on the importance of data, the importance of development, that it's not a snap of the fingers. We can't produce products, with a snap of the fingers. It does take time, and the process needs to be adhered to. So, but perhaps there are some opportunities to really embrace technology even more today than they may have been 3 or 4 months ago. So with that, I'm going to close our call today. If you've got other questions, those that have stuck with us, please reach out to Courtney or Evelyn. And if you've got any questions of the panelists, they will forward questions to us. I think we could probably, I'm going to go on a limb here and say we could probably talk about this for another several hours. Okay. But most people have some additional things to do on Friday. But we appreciate your participation. If there are other topics that you'd like us to address at some point, this is one in a series of what we call Uncommon Conversations. And Lindsay would be delighted to hear from you if you've got a topic you'd like us to discuss. Again, we can pontificate on just about anything. But again, I think this has been a great opportunity to share our perspectives, and we learn a lot from our interactions with our colleagues and our clients. And so with that, I thank everybody for participating today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.